So Arvind isn't just the head of research at IBM. He is the driving force behind a new project called the Hyperledger, which seeks to take some of the key ideas behind the Bitcoin digital currency, a big idea in particular called the blockchain, and bring that essentially to the rest of the world to help reinvent so many other aspects of business through this big idea. Arvind, the first question is the biggest question. The blockchain is a fascinating thing in many respects, but it's difficult for some people to kind of wrap their head around what exactly it is. How do you explain to the layman what the blockchain is and what it can do?
So maybe an example will help. So first, what blockchain does is it enables trust between multiple parties, because trust is often hard to do. It also makes it impossible to cheat. So let's take an example. Let's take something from an old world process like trading. And you could say that there's a merchant in New York and they'd like to buy sweaters from a manufacturer in China. And how do they do that? They get a letter of credit from a bank, probably 2 or 3 months before they're going to go do this. And that's a process that hasn't changed ever since Marco Polo went to China. That was 700 years ago. So you take that letter and then you go out there and you go get your sweaters, and perhaps they're going to put them on a truck, and then they're going to go into a port, and then they're going to go on a ship. If you're on a blockchain, each of those would actually be a block on the blockchain. Then they get off someplace, let's say the port of New York, they got to get through customs, they look at a bill of lading, they go to a warehouse, they arrive at the retail warehouse, and finally then they might agree, all right, release that letter of credit, and maybe another 30 or 60 days later, the manufacturer gets their money. If you could really put this on the blockchain, and all these parties, the ports, the shippers, the manufacturer, the retailer can trust each other, which is what the blockchain enables, then you finally get the friction of commerce removed, the money can flow faster, you can take away much of this friction in terms of detentions and capital getting locked up for 30, 60, 90 days, and you enable these processes. That's a physical world process, and the reason I like to talk about it is because blockchain is often viewed as being great for digital currency and capital markets, but it really extends far beyond that.
Right. You're right. So it did start with the Bitcoin digital currency, and I think if you take a step back, a good way to think about it is that the blockchain is a ledger. In the case of Bitcoin, it's a public ledger that is run by machines across the globe. So rather than having to go to a central entity who controls the ledger, it's controlled by machines, essentially, across the globe. And so what you can do is you can take that idea, and people do take the blockchain itself, and use it in this way to, some people are already looking to, say, put the stock market on the blockchain, which we can talk about later. But essentially, rather than having these machines govern the movement of money, you can have them govern the movement of stock or anything else that has value, right?
That's right. So the blockchain says there isn't. So trust happens when there isn't one entity that controls everything. Because today, if you look at a government organization or an agency or a bank, you are effectively having to trust them. You don't get a choice. And your recourse is through a legal system or through a long, arduous process later. When you get to a blockchain where multiple entities are getting together and enough of them agree on something, a process called consensus, then everything out there is in the open. Once it's in the open, by the way, you cannot change a previous transaction. That is what enables this trust. But also it enables a great deal of transparency. So I believe things like corruption and all anti-money laundering will decrease when these things are all out in the open, and enough people out there have to agree on it, but not necessarily everyone. You can tolerate a few corruptions, you can tolerate a few people misbehaving, and that is the power of the computer science behind blockchain.
Right. One area that I often like to think about that could be reinvented by this is the stock loan market. So much of the market is driven by stock loans. So I borrow stock from one entity, and then I sell it in an effort to make a profit on my own. The way it works now, it's not always clear where the stock, whose hands the stock is in. If you have a blockchain that runs the stock loan market, you can always know where each piece of stock is at any given time.
Right. So a couple of things there. So the stock loan market, or I'll call it the whole, in this case, a form of a derivatives market, is that I might want to sell something short, so I need to borrow it in order to be able to sell it short. I need to offer collateral. I need to worry about, am I meeting all the conditions? Am I meeting all the credit these things? When do I pay it back? There's a lot of these underlying processes. And today you often do that through a manual process or through people at desks governing all this. Instead, you can open up the market. If you put it on a blockchain, people can say, hey, I'm willing to loan my stock out for a month or for a week. You can say, here are the conditions under which I'll loan it. This is the kind of a profit I need to make when I do that. Somebody else can say, I want to borrow. This is my credit worthiness or the collateral I might put up. This is what I'll pay. And then the blockchain can actually attach what are called contracts. It can enable then the automated flow of all of these transactions and monies depending on those contracts getting executed by machines. So really, you can bring forward something that's a 40, 50-year-old process and really bring it into a day of automation and cloud computing.
So many people are doing this type of thing on the blockchain proper, so on the ledger that underpins Bitcoin. And in many ways, we're going to get into a very religious argument here. It gets a lot of people stirred up. But you're not using that. What you have done, in essence, is create your own blockchain software, correct? And that's what Hyperledger is. And why have you gone that route?
Yeah. So also, I'll say not our own, and we'll get into the open source later. We wrote something and we contributed it to an open source project run by the Linux Foundation called Hyperledger. So in the end, it won't be our own, it'll be the world's. It's a true open source with open source governance. So putting that aside, Bitcoin is an anonymous blockchain. And the problem with anonymous is that when you want to understand who are you dealing with, you don't know. When you want to understand, am I sure that I'm safe from money laundering? Am I sure I'm not dealing with somebody from a nation where you're not allowed to do trade, which national governments around the globe worry about? So you've got to have what we call a permissioned network. By permissioned, it doesn't mean that it's private. Permission means it's out there, but you have to know who you're dealing with. You can keep your transaction private or as many elements of it private as you like, and that's part of the underlying cryptography. But it's permissioned as in there is an identity service, so I know I'm dealing with somebody who's putting their identity out there associated with the transaction. So if anyone wants to follow back, wants to take recourse, wants to make sure you're not dealing with a corrupt entity, all that is exposed. And that's a critical part of what's needed, I believe, for all these other applications to thrive.
Got it. I think on the other side of that, if you look at Bitcoin, as it exists look at the blockchain as it exists on Bitcoin, part of the appeal to the idea is that rather than, say, having to rely on all the middlemen on Wall Street, you're relying on machines, right? That intellectual idea appeals to a lot of people. But then if you start talking about, well, Wall Street controlling, your permissioned blockchain, it kind of eats into that really appealing, really big idea. It seems to be a balance there. And how do you keep it from being Goldman Sachs, who controls their own blockchain? Then it just becomes a Goldman Sachs database.
That's right. So I think providing identities doesn't mean that you now go back to a government or a single bank to provide all this. So a blockchain's got to be out there. You've got to have identity services on it. Identity services may come from more than one entity, and they need not be government. You could actually enable many private players to participate in providing identity. And the moment you do that, but it's on a blockchain, again, I'll go back to you need some open governance, so you have standards of how you do that. And I think that's very important. I mean, there's a very coarse analogy to the internet. In the internet, there are authorities like DNS and so forth who authorize computers in that case to be on the internet, and they provide them addresses and so forth. And that does allow that if you later ever need to trace, you can trace back. It doesn't mean that no corruption happens, no, but it does avoid a lot of it. It's going to be similar, I think, in the blockchain. You need a way to do that so that I'm not dealing with maybe an entity like North Korea.
You mentioned the fact that you have open sourced this, so shared the code with the world at large, so anyone can use it or anyone can modify it. And I still feel, even though open source is such an old idea and it gets written about, that people don't completely understand that the tech world now runs this way, right? It's almost counterintuitive that IBM would build this system and then in essence immediately give it away before it's done, let alone before anyone has used it.
Yeah.
But this is the way things work.
I think it's about the speed of doing it. So I believe, and IBM believes, that blockchain is a big idea. It's going to impact almost everything in the real economy. So the question is, how do you make sure that that happens? So last October, we looked at this and we said, we need to make this into open source. Why? Because it then allows everyone to embrace it without feeling afraid that any one entity has proprietary knowledge or has proprietary code that's going to be at the heart of this really important inflection. So by December, we had announced, working with the Linux Foundation, that there will be a Linux Foundation project. By the way, it wasn't just us, 30 other people joined it right away. By January, there were, I think, over 2,000 asking to join, which shows the speed. Because by the way, for the Linux Foundation, that's the most ever in the shortest period of time who want to be part of an open source project. We donated 44,000 lines of code by December into the project. Others are beginning to donate code as well. So allowing that really allows the base fabric to become common and to really become something that enables everyone to take advantage. And then you got to win by actually doing things on top of the base fabric, which is something common for the whole industry. And I think that being common will give it a speed that would have been impossible for anyone to achieve on their own.
Again, to get back to that big blockchain idea, if you take it to its logical extreme, you could say, hey, if you have machines that can do this, you could eliminate all of Wall Street, right? You could eliminate all the middlemen. And yet, when you made this announcement with Hyperledger, you open source it, you start this project, we had entire stock markets, huge Wall Street banks being part of this. Are they, how committed are they to this? Are they just saying, we're worried this is going to disrupt us, so to speak, and they want to get ahead of it? Are they really going to use this?
Yeah, so first, the set of people who joined this actually go across all fronts. So there are big banks. I mean, JP Morgan Chase is an example, but there are plenty of others. There's big tech companies. I mean, not just us, but folks like Intel and Cisco were in there. There were consortia who are doing interoperability like R3. There are startups like DAH. And these are just exemplars. Plenty of others joined it. So there's a wide set of people. So the Wall Street banks are embracing it because they realize that this disruption will happen. And they'd rather be part of it and they'd rather be ahead of it and embrace it with speed, because those who embrace it with speed will not be the ones to get disrupted. It'll be the others. But we should also be careful. I mean, things can get ahead of the reality. It's not going to replace all of Wall Street. It is going to replace some processes and some functions. So if I look at an actual stock trading, going out today to, let's say, buy IBM stock, I don't believe that that's going to happen on the blockchain. Stock lending could happen, because those trades that I'm talking about happen in milliseconds and microseconds. The blockchain, by its nature of wanting to get agreement across lots of computers, is not going to happen in milliseconds and microseconds right now. So some processes are going to very much remain in exchanges, in banks. Others are going to shift to here. And by the way, even when they shift here, if you need collateral, if I need money flowing from country A to country B, there is going to be one on both sides, but perhaps other middlemen will get removed.
Yeah, I think you're right. The speed with which the stock market operates as far as trading happens so fast. The blockchain as it stands today is not going to keep up with that. But underneath the covers, if you and I make a stock trade, the actual settlement of the stock is still this archaic system where it takes 3 days for the actual stock to trade hands. And that seems to be low-hanging fruit for this type of idea.
Absolutely. So the reason it takes 3 days today is because there isn't a place where the asset is recorded, right? People need to make sure that this is all correct. So I think for sure there are some analytics you'll want to run always to make sure there's no insider trading, there's no other form of collusion, but those take a couple of hours. Then you take all this other time to settle because, to be honest, it hasn't changed in 50 years. So you really need to put a new process on it to say, look, settlement can happen, maybe not at T+0, which is what some people say, because I do believe some analytics would run, but it doesn't need to be T+3 days. Maybe we can take it down to T+half a day. So the next morning as you wake up, the money's in your account. And we're seeing a couple of experiments on this. I mean, we know that The Australian Stock Exchange is doing experiments on the blockchain. By the way, so is the Japan Stock Exchange, as is the London Stock Exchange. And they're all looking at different aspects about improving I'll call it the settlement process, not necessarily the front end of trading itself.
I have to say, despite the promise of this idea, I think that a lot of the hype is well ahead of what is actually happening. But I did want you to explain that IBM is in the process of building a hyperledger system of its own that will work in the real world and provide some of this benefit that you've talked about.
Absolutely. So most of you probably realize that IBM is a reasonably large company. And as a part of being a large company, we do a lot of transactions, and we do a fair amount of financing for our clients as they buy hardware and other equipment. To put some numbers on it, we finance about $44 billion a year. We do about 2.9 million transactions of reasonably high-priced equipment in most cases that flows from a manufacturing site out to a client or a partner. In the process of doing all that, through our existing current and traditional systems, you come across disputes, you come across wrong paperwork, you come across capital getting tied up because you don't usually finance a client for more than a certain amount, which seems fair by most risk standards. So putting on all this on a blockchain, we figured that out of the 25,000 disputes we get per year, we can probably resolve about half of them a lot faster. It takes about 40 days to resolve a dispute today. We believe we'll bring it down to less than 10 days with the visibility on a blockchain. We believe that the capital that gets tied up, which is measured in the tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds, will get freed up a lot quicker in days as opposed to 40 or 50 days. So those advantages are massive because that means clients get happier, their sort of credit limits are not tied up, or all the manufacturing gets happier because disputes are resolved much faster. By the way, these disputes can be silly about things like tax rates, about things like, the shipment was not received or you got the wrong shipment. All of this can really be cleaned up on a blockchain, so tremendous benefits.
Got it.
And by the way, it goes real. So it's a proof from us that if we can trust $44 billion of annual financing on a blockchain, that tells you how much we trust the technology.
Got it. All right, let's open it up to questions again for Arvind. Here we go.
How do you think blockchain is going to affect real estate, say title insurance or reporting deeds and real estate in general?
Yeah, so the question was about blockchain and real estate. So I think first of all, let's separate it into the developed world, or one where there's a very strong legal system, and the world which is still developing. Real estate fraud and corruption is huge in the latter part, in the developing world, because titles get lost actually, which is not so common in the US, but it happens in other places. I think in that world, putting the title itself on a blockchain means it's impossible for somebody to pretend it's lost. You can't pretend the file got lost, right? Yes, you got changed, but the original record is also still there. Two, I think the speed of transaction goes up because often there is settlement, there's escrow agents and so on. So even in the developed world, I think it's real estate, it's automobiles, it's anything with reasonable tangible value. Why do we tend to go, there's a seller, there's a broker, there's an escrow agent, then there is a town hall. You can really put all these things on a blockchain and it can evolve. Now, you can say, why isn't it happening already? There's regulations, there is also due process. So people understand, hey, if it happens that way, I can do that. So it's got to be done arm in arm with regulators, with the entities wanting to build these new processes, and probably in the real estate case, if it's the Western world, I'll call it state and local government. If it's not the Western world, probably the central governments to go enable this. I was in Africa recently, and one of the nations there, I'll say, is beginning to make tiny steps on that. They're actually putting all of their real estate transactions for a particular city out in the open, and they have in mind that they'd like to then enable the actual transaction to also happen on technologies like this. So I think baby steps are being made, and I think that that's one that can see a tremendous amount of benefit.
How long into the future do you see the U.S., do you see blockchain being used instead of courthouses?
I think in the US it's going to take longer because the need for fraud and all that is not very big, and it's a very mature legal system for real estate at least. But I think for other goods, example, containers of goods coming into the country from elsewhere and things like that, I think blockchain will happen a lot quicker. And once that happens, then that'll enable all the rest's imagination to get unlocked.
Time for one more quick one.
Hi, so I have a question about security. So as it becomes more popular, obviously more and more transaction and more cash flow will happen using the blockchain. And obviously it will instantly attract hackers and hostile governments to possibly take over the private root certificate, which is the main root certificate that you have to own to issue other certificates that then they are used to sign those transactions. So what do you have to say about that potential scenario? Because that would probably be an Armageddon if at this point, once it's popular, somebody evil gets a hold of the root certificate.
So lots of answers. So one, so even if you get all of the root certificate, you don't obviate all the certificates out there. So, and it is those that are used to actually sign transactions, encrypt transactions, govern the privacy and security and so on. But if you get all of the root, yeah, you're right. You can issue other certificates and so forth, right? So you have to step back and say, what are the techniques that you can use to go protect the root certificate? So I fundamentally believe if something is that important, you got to get into technologies like tamper-proof hardware. You got to get into areas where you've actually done a full verification of your issuing hardware, which means you cannot really put it out on some general purpose computer that is generic. You need to worry about those things. I'll sort of point to us and say, we have a little bit of experience on that since a lot of central banks around the world do work on IBM hardware, and there are a lot of advantages you can do for certain things, and those things are well worth putting into that class of hardware, right? But even if you try and x-ray the machine, the certificates will get destroyed, and that means, of course, you got to go have a backup copy and a safety copy, but disconnected from the network per se. So a lot of approaches like that, which the cryptographers do understand. They're not used commonly because they tend to be expensive, but for something with that much value, you would go use them. It could be a scenario for James Bond movies, and many of those tend to have a fair amount of imagination and fiction in there.
James Bond, a good way to end. Thank you, Arvind.
Cade, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.